Hello and welcome to the second in a series of sew-alongs for the Emily dress. I'm making a small series of sew-alongs for this dress to show the different options. So in the first video I started making a jumbo cord version with the bucket pockets and no seam detail, and in this video I'm going to start making a second version made in denim. I'm going to have the centre front seam. I'm going to put inseam pockets and the bib front pocket on this version just to show the differences. So what I've already done to start with is I have prepared the front panel by stitching the centre front seam together. So all I've done is I've stitched the 1.5 seam allowance and then I've overlocked the two together. You could pressed it to one side, and of course you could also zigzag stitch this to neaten the raw edge. And then like I said, I've pressed it to one side. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run a top stitch along this seam just to sort of enhance it, make more of a feature of it. But before I do that, I just want to mention it is important to make sure this seam allowance is the 1.5, because in a later stage we're going to fix the facing piece to the top edge of the dress, and if you haven't taken the correct seam allowance, you'll find that this doesn't fit properly. It'll either be too big or too small, and you see there it needs to be the same, and you achieve that by making this seam allowance the right size. So with that done, I'm going to top stitch, like I said, just top stitch down this centre front, and I'm using a heavy top stitch thread. And the one thing I would recommend if you are using a top stitch thread is to buy a top stitch needle which has a larger eye and makes sewing top stitching much easier with the top stitch thread. So I'm just going to go ahead and stitch that now, and then we'll move on to the next stage. A single line. I'm going to leave it as a single line of top stitching, and what I've done as well is I've deliberately stitched about 3mm away from the seam to give it more of a feature. If you go too close you can end up, you know, not coming off the thing and making it look a little bit messy, so I actually quite like it if it's a couple of mils away from the seam like that. So what we're going to do next is we're going to prepare the pocket, the bib pocket, which again I have started preparing this by overlocking the top edge, and again you could do this with zigzag or you could even double turn it, but I quite like to not add too much bulk by just doing a finished edge like this. And I've marked little nicks where the fold line is. Just about see that. So we're going to put right sides together and stitch folding at that nick and stitch down to the end of that facing piece on both edges. So I'm just going to move on to this sewing machine. I've got one set up for top stitch thread and one set up with regular thread here. So that's stitched in place, and what I would say is it is worth doing some back stitching at the top and the bottom. This is a very small bit, so that stitching could easily come undone, so always do your reinforcing at the top and the bottom. Now I'm going to just trim those corners and turn this through. I can find some scissors. Okay. Just trimming that bulk away from the corners and turn that through. I'm going to go and press this now to make that a nice sharp edge, but just before I do that I'm going to prepare the lower edge of this, and if you've watched the last video you already would have seen this, but it's doing a large long stitch around the curve that we're going to just gently draw up to make a nice even curve around here. So all you need to do is, within the seam allowance ideally, is just stitch like a gather thread, but just an ease thread around the main part of the curve, just starting ahead of where the curve starts and finishing. It doesn't have to be an exact thing. Let's just do that. There we go, you can probably see a little bit better on that side. So now I'm going to go and press this, and I'm going to come back in a minute. So I've pressed the pocket top, and what I've also done is I have drawn a tailor's chalk line across the pocket at the point in where I want to top stitch it, because with top stitching thread I'm using regular thread on the bottom, so I need to work on the right side to have the top stitching on the right side. So the 2.5 line from the top edge to the line means that the stitching at the back will come just above the overlocked edge. So I'm going to go ahead now and just stitch that line of top stitching. There we go. So that's nice and even on the outside, and it's all caught in on the inside. So now the next stage is the same stage as we did on the bucket pockets on the previous video, and I also have a video on here just focusing only on stitching a curved pocket. But I'm going to pull the thread end to start to gather this curved edge up, but before I get to the point where it gathers is where I want to be, just to be able to create a nice curve. So can you see I'm just starting to gather that up. I'm going to go all the way around the edge, and then I'm going to take it to the iron and to press the edge in. And this really works with thick fabrics very well actually. You feel it's a bit awkward pulling it in, but actually when you're pressing it, it works really nicely. So when you're at the stage where you just start to see it gathering, you can take that over to the iron. And like I said, I've got a full video focusing only on this if you want to watch that separately. But I'm going to go off now and press that seam allowance in. So I'm just pressing it and tweaking it as I go to get a nice smooth curve. So I'll come back in a moment with that. So I have now pressed the edges in, and what I like to do at this stage is just to fold the pocket in half and check that your curves are nice and symmetrical, because at this stage you can still tweak this a little bit if you feel the shape isn't quite symmetrical before you pin it on. And now I'm going to pin this following the marks on the pattern onto the front of the pinafore dress. But just while I'm still at this sewing machine, I'm going to start the inseam pockets. So I've already overlocked around these, and this is something you can either do at this stage or you can do after you've stitched them on. But in this case I've decided to overlock these round just before starting. So there are notches on the side seams, and again I've made little nicks so that I can see where to place the pockets. So we need right sides together. Let's find the correct one and place the pocket between those two notches. So I'm just going to pin that in place so it looks like this. Now with this seam you need to stitch this 1 centimetre in, so that basically it will sit slightly inside the seam allowance when you stitch the side seams. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch that on all 4 pockets along here, and then I shall come back and show you how that looks. And remember to switch your stitch back to regular size stitch and not your gather stitch size. Always an easy mistake to make, that, isn't it? So what I've done is I have stitched all 4 pocket bags to the side seams in, so 2 on the front and 2 on the back, and then I've pressed the seam towards the sides, and I've also gone down the whole line just to overlock that edge so that it's easier to you know, to have it finished at this point when you come to sew. So there we are. I've stitched the stitched this seam. Hopefully you can see that it pivots at that corner, and this is set, the actual seam of the pocket is set slightly in. So on the outside you'll see that the seam is just slightly inside, so when you press this flat it's just set in a little bit. You see that, and there's the seam when that's nicely pressed. So basically the next thing to do is to do exactly the same process on the other side, and then I'm going to come back in the next video. I'm going to bring back the jumbo cord version and take that on to the next step, and then in the video after that we'll take this one to the next step. So I hope you enjoyed that sew along, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel if you'd like to see some more videos, and hopefully see you again soon.